Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's edition of our Design Diaries. And today we have with us Felix. Felix is a designer and a former UI developer, and we'll love to know a lot more about his journey. So, Felix, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, Aaron. My journey is a bit more convoluted, I guess. It starts with probably a pretty funny anecdote because I actually started in the vocational training student program at SAP here in Germany. And on the day of my interview, there were lots of other courses that were getting introduced before they went to one-on-one interviews. And I actually went to the wrong group. And turns out I was with the group that studied digital media. And that's typically the course that you would take to a later point become a UX designer. So I guess that's kind of like tempting fate a little bit there. But luckily I did get pulled out back to my actual course, kind of like started the career track to a front-end developer from that point on. I noticed even then I was typically gravitating towards kind of like places where I could work closely with designers and where I could pick out some backlog items that I felt had the biggest impact on users, or at least perceived impact on users. So I very quickly did sort of the specialization towards front-end development and then as close to UX design as I possibly could.
Fantastic journey. I feel like I can relate to a little bit of what you just said. But it's also interesting for me, and like as you're going through the journey, typically, we do a lot of different things. As a front-end developer, you would be responsible for producing sort of the user interface, developing it to the degree of fidelity and quality that users can appreciate. And one thing that I learned pretty early on in my career, Felix, just to share a little bit, is that design can design all they want. At the end of the day, it needs to be available in some sort of a format, whether it's code enabled or not, that users can use. So for me, the magic sauce of ideation to consumption happens to be the UI developers. And I also see that there is some perception of what a UI developer does or doesn't do, how well they work with design or not. And there are two camps often, and in good intent. There's the push and pull of time, quality, scope, as well as fidelity. But it's an interesting place to be as a professional, if you really consider yourself as a professional, to build something, regardless of your craft and regardless of your role. We're all trying to do a job. But doing a job being a UI developer versus doing a job being a designer, maybe the perspectives are slightly different. And in a lot of ways, what has surprised me personally is that if you ask the UI developer what they want, and if you ask a designer what they want, they articulate it differently, but you can definitely connect the dots. But looking back in your journey so far, as you stepped into development and as you started working with designers, what was the most surprising part about I'll call it the realities and perceptions of UI development versus designers?
I totally second a lot of the things you just mentioned because I also see kind of like what separates excellent designers from really good designers is kind of the ability to navigate in a world where there's so many conflicts of interest, where there's so many cognitive biases at work, and just like oftentimes less than ideal environments that you have to kind of weaselly your way around to get what you want as a designer, or at least get as close to what you want as a designer. So I totally second that, because to me it's like, yes, what the quality of what you're producing is what the users actually see at the end, and there's so much stuff in between that goes into getting to that point. But in terms of what surprised me between reality of development versus design, one thing that really shocked me when I in the first couple of weeks, even when I transitioned, was how big of a part the whole communication strategy is. So the ability to be a mediator, to be a facilitator with multiple people in the room. People tend to look towards designers to be the ones that can effectively play that mediative role. Once you understand how to harness that to then also basically communicate in a way and in an eloquent way where you get your point across as well and kind of are representing your own interests as a designer, that's super powerful. And that's actually something that, looking back, I would have also liked to know when I was a developer, because good developers are social developers and developers that can talk from different perspectives about what they're building. But as a designer, it was super glaringly obvious that that's a skill that you need, especially because of all the different types of roles that you're collaborating with. Yeah, that would be the main thing for me.
Wonderful thing that I just heard, good developers or social developers. It's interesting because design, as you said, also has this perception of being the facilitators, the communicators, and to a large extent, I would agree. But in order to get things done, the communication aspect holds true for every stakeholder, every team member. And often I have seen that clear articulation can come at different levels of not only within the craft, within designers, but also architects and developers and product management who are trying to wrestle around what problem are we trying to solve? Because I think that's the bigger chunk of, communication lapses that happen is for stakeholders working on a problem. They think they know what the problem is. They have their own articulation, but it's actually different. And to a large extent, I think that it's a people business. Building anything is a people business because you're working with others to get the job done. And the more we are able to articulate in a common language, that's the other part that I learned in my experience as a designer working with developers is sometimes the lingo is different. It's very different. And it's important for both sides to kind of level set on the common vocabulary, right? Like we talk about, we as in design would talk about information architecture, content strategy. These are, and UI developers would talk about, CSS, SAS variables, etc., very different things. But if you were to have a common conversation, it would be about level setting on the correct language to use. So my learning was, as a designer, to be able to articulate the right point of view, I need to be able to talk at the level and use the language that the other stakeholders are used to. It's not about us trying to show off what we do. Sometimes the designers preach a lot about the process, and I call it the sausage making. And the UI developers in general are good at the making, right? So there's a difference between the articulating and the making, and there's often a challenge. And I wonder if you were to reflect a little bit, sometimes UX designers or designers in general do not understand or appreciate technical limitations. And, there are some, again, perceptions that, hey, developers are prioritizing time to deliver over the little details that we as the design community care about. Where do you see the biggest disconnect? Because when I talk to developers, the good ones, they're like, yeah, we want it of high quality too. So question back to you, where do you see the biggest disconnect between UI developers and designers? And if you extend it a little bit more, how can it be bridged so that both sides feel heard and they are trying to solve the same problem?
I try it with as fact-based approach as possible in my engagement. So sure, as you mentioned, it's super important to speak the language of the other roles that you're collaborating with. I found that in my experience talking with developers, as soon as you whip out the variable names or function names or specific places in the documentation, you'll have respect very quickly, which is a nice added benefit of kind of being in that hybrid role. But I think the biggest disconnect or the biggest conflict of interest that you have, which is very painful if you know both sides of it, is that sometimes you're in a situation where the tool set that the developers have available to them to build what you've designed for them sometimes is totally limiting them to kind of achieve that. And it's super unfortunate because you could be in a situation where you're aligned on what the problem is you're trying to solve. You're aligned on what the user needs are, and your developers would even want to deliver something that meets those needs. But then sometimes you're in a situation where it's just at the current state of the UI framework I'm using, for example, I can't get this here without, introducing multiple bad practices into the code base and completely messing up performance. So one concrete example of where I've tried this fact-based approach, as I was alluding to earlier, was be as transparent as possible. Show your developers and your product managers all of the design options you're considering, and then plot them on a graph with different criteria.
So what he said really resonates with me. And I think one of the interesting things for me is that now that you've gone through the journey of being a UI developer, now you're into design and UX, do you sometimes look at like the code that is being generated by our fellow UI developers and I go, I could have built this differently, perhaps better aligned from a user perspective, or even the other way around. If you look at a designer coming up with design artifacts or design concepts and go, yeah, that's beautiful and that's cool, but as a developer, this is going to be crazy to build. So the trade-offs are insane, both sides. So what's your thought on that in going through this journey?
I think, looking at it as a world of trade-offs, I catch myself more often than not on the sort of like design criticism side of it, because I'm looking at something and I think, wow, this is going to be tough to build. Maybe I need to be a designer for longer to start thinking the other way around. But I think it goes back to my value system that I kind of elaborated on earlier, where I see like the value of a designer mainly being how do you produce something as close as possible to what you want in an imperfect world.
Hey, imperfect world it is, and it's the juxtaposition of trying to, the pursuit of perfection. There's no perfection. It's an evolution. And I think to what you just said, the ability to critique something and look at it and go, you know what, this could have been done better. To me, it's a reflection of us setting higher bars of quality, higher bars of excellence. And that's a great thing. I do think that if each one of us started doing that, and not from a concept of like there's something wrong with what's been built, but more about how we can make it better. And so to me, it's like the journey and evolution of what's good enough, that bar keeps changing. And I think if you have developers and designers like you in the industry, we will see positive impacts because we are constantly thinking, right? And so I really appreciate you sharing that point of view, because I think it's a fairly unique way of looking at things. Felix, we could talk for hours. Thank you for your time. I think I learned a lot about you, but some of my key takeaways is that your journey into UI development and then into design, you have, I guess, increased your aperture on things that matter, the shared vocabulary, talking the language to your stakeholders so they can get more, alignment done on the problem to solve. So overall, I think the industry is in good hands if we have, developers and designers like you who are there to connect the dots and really think about what it means to develop and design products that the users love, appreciate, and also it brings out the best in what we do as developers and designers. With that, thank you, Felix. Thanks for being on the show. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks for having me.